It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Brazil's most popular politician, former President Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party, suffered a major blow to his presidential campaign on Wednesday. An appeals court upheld a conviction for corruption against him and increased his sentence from 9.5 years to 12 years in prison. Lula is currently the front-runner in this year's presidential campaign and enjoys 36% support, more than double that of his nearest challenger. The court ruling could bar Lula from running for president unless another appeals court overturns the decision. During a press conference held shortly after the appeals court's decision, Lula's lawyer had this to say.
O que nós vimos foi que, mais uma vez, o ex-presidente Lula foi condenado sem que ele tenha praticado um crime. Os votos lidos durante o dia não conseguiram demonstrar qualquer elemento que indicasse a prática de um crime.
Joining me now to analyze the ruling in Brazil is Mark Weisbrot. Mark is the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and is the author of Failed: What Experts Got Wrong About the Global Economy. He joins me today from Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Thank you, Sharmini.
Mark, recently you wrote an opinion article in the New York Times in which you argue that Brazil's court cannot be considered impartial. Explain to us what you meant by that.
Well, the trial judge has demonstrated his partisanship on numerous occasions. That's Judge Moro. And he's, first of all, he illegally wiretapped Lula and released to the media conversations between Lula and his attorney, between Lula and Dilma, and this became a huge part of the campaign against Lula, these wiretap conversations, partly because they were cited out of context, and the media was very much against, or has been very much against Lula and the Workers' Party for many years. And then he also did other things. I mean, for example, he had Lula arrested at his home and taken away for questioning, and with the media given leaked advance notice to create this huge spectacle that played into the opposition theme that Lula was a criminal, where, Lula had repeatedly volunteered to answer any questions. He didn't have to be arrested or taken away in police cars and with heavy security and all these things. So these were things that showed very clearly that he was biased against Lula.
Mark, were there any incriminating evidence in these tapes that were released of the conversations that he had with Dilma, his lawyer, or anyone else?
Well, some of it was portrayed as incriminating because one of the conversations was about Dilma appointing Lula to the cabinet, in which case he could not be prosecuted except by the Supreme Court. But I think the main significance of releasing these things, and Moro had to apologize to the Supreme Court for doing this, is one, the wiretaps themselves were illegal, and two, releasing it to the media was part of a political campaign against Lula in which this judge was participating.
So, Mark, were there any credible evidence that actually implicated Lula to warrant a conviction?
Well, that's the big problem with this case. I mean, he was accused of accepting an apartment, a remodeled apartment, as a bribe, and they never showed that they had no documentary evidence that he accepted anything, that he had no title to the apartment, he never stayed in the apartment. And so the case revolved around the testimony of one convicted construction company executive who had his sentence, he plea bargained, and he had his sentence reduced by more than 80%. He was originally sentenced to 16 years. And the judge, who in this case is the investigating judge and the trial judge, also cut off his plea bargain when he originally told the same story as Lula did and didn't resume plea bargaining until after he changed his story in order to implicate Lula. So it looks very terrible.
And what is it we know about this Judge Moro and his affiliation to the United States? Because there's been a lot of talk about that this particular case against Lula is being initiated partly from the United States.
Well, I think he is, well, that's another thing about him. He is well connected with the U.S. foreign policy establishment. He had a State Department fellowship here. He's come to Washington to speak and is invited by, establishment institutions who portray him as this heroic figure fighting corruption and have ignored all the partisan things that I've mentioned.
And why are these judges so opposed to Lula?
Well, the entire elite of Brazil, most of them were opposed to Lula and the Workers' Party. They never were really a part of this establishment. Lula ran 4 times over decades for president. The Workers' Party came from powerful grassroots movements and labor. Lula himself and Dilma were both jailed under the dictatorship. And so they don't come from that elite. And, some people have even criticized the Workers' Party and leadership for thinking that they were actually accepted as, as legitimate government by these people when they weren't. And I think that showed when they impeached Dilma in 2016 for something that wasn't even a crime. Either the federal prosecutor even said it wasn't a crime. So they were never really accepted. And of course, they did carry out some policies that were not liked at all by the most powerful interests in the country. In particular, the increase in wages. The wages increased in real inflation-adjusted terms about 35% by 2014, and the real minimum wage was increased by 76%. And a lot of people didn't like that. They also, for a time, had policies that the financial sector didn't like, where Dilma pushed back against the attempts by the central bank to raise interest rates. And again, sometimes it wasn't enough. And that's part of the reason they had that terrible recession in 2014, which is what led to, or was used as, the political ammunition to impeach Dilma.
Right. Now, when most people look at the judiciary and the courts, they see it as a relatively independent body that is reliable. Why is it so different in the case of Brazil?
Well, I don't think the judiciary is, it's always a matter of degree how independent. Most of Latin America doesn't have really independent judiciaries. Again, to a certain extent, there's a lot of questions about the independence of our own judiciary, especially since the Bush v. Gore decision of 2000 in the presidential election. So we have problems here as well. It's become a much more partisan judiciary. But I think in the case of Brazil, what made this so much worse is that it appears to be a real attempt to decapitate the Workers' Party. Again, first with this apparently unconstitutional impeachment, and then followed by trying to remove the front runner in the presidential race 9 months from now. So that's what makes it, I think, so outrageous and really undermines the legitimacy of any results that are going to come out of the October election if Lula is not allowed to run.
Mark, back when Lula was president between 2003 and 2011, many on the left complained that Lula was actually too cozy with the country's business elite. Have they turned against him now as a result of having the kind of power that they do directly with people like Temer?
I think, most of Brazil's ruling elite never wanted the Workers' Party, and they took the first opportunity they could to get rid of them and win what they couldn't win at the ballot box, first with the impeachment and then with the persecution of Lula. And so, it's not all that surprising. And, you mentioned the U.S. role. I didn't really get to fully answer that because that's important as well. As you know, the U.S. government was against all of these left governments that were elected since 1998 in, Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Ecuador, Bolivia, El Salvador, Nicaragua. And so Brazil is no exception. They had to, of course, they were more careful with what they said about Brazil usually. But for example, when the lower house of Congress in Brazil in the spring of 2016 voted to impeach Dilma, just 2 or 3 days later, the leader of that impeachment in the Senate, who was the Aloysio Nunes, who was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, came to the U.S. and met with Tom Shannon, who was the number 3 official in the State Department and basically in charge of Latin America for the Obama administration, had done all kinds of terrible things in Latin America, including in Honduras after the coup. And they had this meeting, and that was a way, I think, that to signal to anybody who was paying close attention in Brazil that the U.S. supported that coup. And then John Kerry went there, was Secretary of State, then went to Brazil on August 5th of 2016, and he had a joint press conference with the acting foreign minister, José Sarra, and they said, he talked about how wonderful the relationship with Brazil was going to be. And this was before Dilma was formally removed from office. So this was another very broad hint, more than a hint, that, again, Washington supported this unconstitutional impeachment. So they were involved. They did what they could, and probably we'll find out more when documents are released 20 years from now.
Mark, highlight for us some of the economic achievements of the PT governments under Lula and, of course, Dilma Rousseff, compared to where the Temer government is taking the economy.
Yes, well, it's very different. They represent very different interests. So, under Lula, you did have, first of all, you had economic growth for the first time for 23 years. You had almost no growth of income per person from 1980 to 2003. And then you had growth, for more than a decade. And you had, by 2014, poverty was reduced by 55%, extreme poverty by 65%. They raised the real inflation-adjusted minimum wage under the Workers' Party by 76%. Real wages overall rose by 35%. And so these were very significant changes. And then some of them, but not all of them, were reversed in the recession that began in 2014. And that's what the right took advantage of to get rid of Dilma. But now when they came in, the current government, through this parliamentary coup of 2016, they immediately went after pensions, tried and succeeded in changing labor law to weaken organized labor, and have been trying to institute a whole set of regressive reforms to roll back what the Workers' Party accomplished.
All right, Mark, what now? What's going to happen in terms of the appeal and presidential candidacy of Lula?
Well, we don't really know. We don't know if, where the appeals will go. We don't know. I mean, they could try to jail Lula. It seems like they're going to be afraid to do that. I think there's something of a dilemma for them, because if he's not in jail, he's going to campaign. He could even theoretically campaign for someone else, like he did for Dilma in 2010 and really helped her get elected. So as long as he's alive, he's going to be a leader, a very powerful and influential leader of the Workers' Party.
All right, Mark, I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.